Imagine the cold, biting through a fragile wooden door, and the fire, barely clinging to life. How did medieval peasants survive such relentless winters without heating, blankets, or modern clothes? What secrets did they rely on, to not just endure, but to find small moments of comfort in the darkest months? Tonight we'll uncover their humble wisdom, from layers of coarse wool to clever home designs that mimicked the earth's embrace. Their resilience speaks across the centuries, and maybe it still has something to teach us. Please, make yourself comfortable in bed, turn off the lights, wrap yourself in your softest blanket, and let your body settle into stillness. Now, close your eyes and prepare to wake up in a medieval winter. And if you enjoy where I'm taking you, please subscribe to the Sleep Temple and like the video. It truly helps me keep sharing these timeless journeys with you. And while you're here, let us know in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Imagine stepping into a home where the air clings with cold, the walls seem to sigh with the wind's chill, and the fire struggles to warm more than a few feet around it. This wasn't just an occasional discomfort for medieval peasants. It was life. Their homes, while essential shelters, were often drafty, smoky, and far from the cozy refuges we imagine today. Yet, within these humble walls, they crafted a place to endure the winter. How? With ingenuity and a deep understanding of the resources they had. Most peasant homes were single-room structures, their walls composed of wattle and daub, a framework woven with wooden strips and layered with a sticky mixture of clay, straw, and at times, animal manure. This method, though a marvel of resourcefulness, was hardly perfect insulation. On the coldest nights, frost could form on the inside walls, and drafts seeped through even the smallest imperfections. Some peasants relied on strategic placement of earth mounds around the base of their homes, using nature itself as insulation. Piled soil hugged the outer walls, keeping the worst of the cold at bay. This partnership with the earth gave their homes a grounded warmth, albeit limited. Above their heads, thatched roofs provided essential protection from snow and rain, but they were far from airtight. Gaps allowed winter air to creep inside, which paradoxically brought another sort of help: ventilation. With central fires burning inside, this unintended airflow helped reduce the buildup of smoke that otherwise clung thickly to the air, stinging eyes and coating the rafters in soot. Yet still, smoke was a constant companion, lingering and making the winter air inside as challenging as the chill outside. Heat was life, and the fire in the home became the centerpiece of survival. A central fire pit, built with stone and situated in the very heart of the room, produced the core warmth. These fires weren't just practical. They created a gathering place, where light and heat radiated through shared spaces. Some homes had portable braziers, metal bowls filled with burning charcoal or embers, providing warmth to different corners of the room. These braziers came with their risks, as they could easily tip over or consume the oxygen in tightly packed spaces. Balancing warmth and safety was a delicate act, but one that medieval families managed with care. Even the walls themselves played a role in retaining warmth, albeit indirectly. The earth-packed floors, often littered with straw or rushes, acted as a modest barrier against the cold rising from the ground. Over time, layers upon layers of fresh rushes would be added without removing the old, creating a thick, carpet-like surface. This provided some comfort to bare feet and helped to trap heat inside the home. The design may seem rudimentary now, but for the people of the time, it was an effective way to create insulation where none seemed possible. As much as the home relied on these basic structures and materials, warmth often came not from the fire or the walls, but from the people themselves. Communal living was a constant reality for peasants. Multiple family members, sometimes spanning 3 or 4 generations, shared the same square footage. In the coldest months, they might sleep close together for shared body heat, creating a human cocoon against the night's chill. This closeness was born out of necessity, and though it meant sacrificing personal space, it also brought a sense of security. Animals, too, were an integral part of this winter refuge. In many cases, small livestock like chickens, goats, or even a family's cow shared the same building, often sectioned off along one side of the room. Their presence added more than just sustenance. Their natural body warmth contributed to heating the space. The smell of animals may not evoke thoughts of comfort today, but for peasants, it was a welcome trade-off for the life-giving heat they provided. And yet, despite the meager materials and ever-present cold, these homes still offered moments of genuine comfort. Few things were as satisfying as the simple joy of coming in from the freezing air and feeling the faint warmth of the fire on frost-nipped skin. The glow of embers, the smell of wood smoke, and the crackle of burning logs created a sensory refuge that couldn't be ignored. Within these walls, however flawed, families built routines that gave them security and hope through the longest nights. For children, the home held its own share of small adventures. Bundled in whatever scraps of wool or linen could be layered together, they might play in front of the fire, inventing games with sticks or scrap materials left from chores. Winters were also a time of storytelling, with the dark hours inside spent recounting tales of folklore, faith, and family history. These stories, told in the dim firelight, helped to pass the time and strengthened connections. The act of gathering around to listen or share kept spirits warm, even when the cold outside seemed unrelenting. The structure of the home itself gradually reflected the seasons. During the harshest part of winter, homes took on a layered feeling, as families added straw mats, thick curtains, and extra hides across doors or windows to block drafts. The fewer the openings to the outside, the better, although this sometimes intensified the smoke inside. It was a trade-off, one that reminded everyone that, in winter, comfort came from compromise. And it wasn't just the physical structure of the home that mattered. It was the rituals and routines within them that cemented their role as sanctuaries. The mornings might begin with the first signs of a rekindled fire, the heat seeping out slowly and pushing back against the night before. By mid-morning, the family would circle around for breakfast, making use of the fire not only to warm the room, but also to cook simple meals. Mealtimes often became a time of connection and reassurance, moments where everyone could feel the collective warmth, both physical and emotional. Of course, there were always moments where the threat of the cold seemed overwhelming. Winters brought challenges like frost accumulating on the inside of homes, and the efficiency of even the best medieval insulation systems would falter on particularly frigid nights. Still, year after year, families crafted their own solutions with the resources they had, standing as a testament to human ingenuity. Each home, whether made of wattle and daub or nestled against an earth mound, symbolized a deeply practical yet intimate relationship between people and their environment. These homes were never perfect, and they never fully kept the cold out, but they were more than just structures. They were the center of survival, places where life pushed back against winter's grip. Each decision, from where to build the fire pit to how to layer straw on the ground, added to the home's ability to fight the pull of the season. They stood not just as shelters, but as monuments to resourcefulness and determination. And while these homes gave just enough protection to scrape through winter's harshest days, one element within them was truly central to survival: the fire. Whether glowing faintly in a hearth or radiating from a portable brazier, it was more than a source of heat. It was the heart of the home. What made it so essential, even sacred? Let's take a closer look at how fire shaped medieval life. The hearth was more than just a fire in the middle of a home. It was the heart of a family's existence during the medieval winters. Its role stretched far beyond providing warmth, anchoring the rhythms of daily life and symbolizing both physical survival and spiritual protection. Everything revolved around this simple space where flames flickered against the darkness. At its most basic, the hearth was physically central, sitting either on a dirt floor or within a shallow, stone-edged pit. The design was primitive, but it served as the only viable way to heat the drafty homes of the peasant class. This open hearth became the family's lifeline when temperatures dropped, but it came with a cost: smoke, with nowhere to escape properly, hung thick in the air, irritating eyes and throats. Over time, the walls of the home absorbed the soot, leaving blackened stains on already weathered surfaces. Yet, smoke wasn't entirely without benefit. It helped drive out pests like fleas and rats, creating a bittersweet balance between discomfort and necessity. The smell of wood smoke, mingled with the faint animal odors typical of peasant homes, became a constant backdrop. Cooking, of course, was the hearth's unavoidable daily task. Families suspended simple iron cauldrons or hung clay pots from chains to cook soups, stews, and porridges, hearty meals meant to last and stretch modest supplies. Women crouched close to the fire, braving the heat and smoke to stir bubbling mixtures, while children watched nearby, waiting for their next meal to take shape. The fire was demanding, consuming firewood at a steady rate, which forced families to carefully ration their stores of winter fuel. Letting the flames die completely meant risking great difficulty in rekindling them during icy weather, so coals were nursed with precision. The hearth wasn't just practical, it was a focus for togetherness. In homes where survival often felt like a joint effort, families naturally gravitated toward the warmest point of the room. During long winter evenings, they clustered around the fire, sewing, repairing tools, or reshaping dull iron blades. Children played simple games nearby, and grandparents told stories in quiet, rhythmic voices that competed with the crackle of burning wood. The work of the day blended into an evening ritual of connection, a rare pause to cherish one another amid the season's hardships. But while the open hearth dominated most peasant homes, some families benefited from better heating systems. Earthen or stone stoves, impressively effective in design, appeared in regions with more advanced building expertise or greater supplies of stone and clay. These stoves absorbed and stored heat, minimizing the need for fire maintenance. Unlike the open pits of simpler homes, the large stoves were fired briefly and slowly radiated their warmth over the course of many hours. They also doubled as multifunctional spaces. People often sat or even slept on top of larger stoves, where the steady release of heat created the coziest and most coveted spot in the household. These structures symbolized more than efficiency. They became centers of comfort and even pride. The construction of these stoves carried symbolic importance. With so much riding on their performance, building a stove became a family endeavor. Every brick or mud-packed wall piece seemed to hold fragments of their hopes for surviving the endless winter nights. These stoves also had smaller niches carved into their sides for storing food that needed to stay warm or drying out wet items like herbs and shoes. For homes fortunate enough to incorporate a stove, their winters didn't necessarily feel easy, but they were undoubtedly more bearable. Beyond the physical, the hearth also carried a heavy symbolic weight. Fire was seen as a direct gift from the divine, or tied to guardian spirits believed to watch over the family. Its survival was so important that spiritual rituals naturally developed around it. Pouring small amounts of milk onto glowing embers, or sprinkling a pinch of ash in a gesture of gratitude, were thought to ensure the fire's protection. To peasants, the fire was alive, and neglecting it or allowing it to extinguish symbolized misfortune, perhaps even a sign that kinship or lives could be lost before winter's end. No one left a fire's care to chance. At night, the flames were carefully subdued, banked under a layer of ash to trap the heat. This glowing core of embers would remain alive through the darkest hours, ready to spring back to life with a simple breath of air and the addition of kindling. Families choreographed their evenings around fire maintenance. Sometimes the task fell to whoever woke first, as tending to that fragile orange glow was an act of love and survival. Fire ensured that the hearth lived on as a protective entity. It symbolized stability when the outside world was all but frozen.
The sacredness of the hearth extended into the way families treated it. It was unthinkable to spit in the fire, toss waste into it carelessly, or disrespect it in any way. This reverence carried with it the understanding that fire granted life but demanded respect in return. Hearths were central figures in the storytelling traditions of the time. Tales of ancestral miracles, folklore, spirits, and even playful fantasies were hushed into life around embers glowing and shadows dancing across crumbling walls.
In those moments, the hearth didn't just warm bodies, it comforted minds and soothed fears of the cold, dark landscapes outside. Hearth fires connected medieval communities as much as they did their families. Houses might stand apart, but the rhythm of maintaining constant warmth created shared experiences, reflected in the centrality of fire-based traditions. Festivals celebrated the longer-burning fires of Yule, or bacchanal releases of logs into flame, and neighbors shared these flames if one family's fire had gone out. Borrowing fire from a neighbor required humility and trust, but also reflected the collective struggle winter imposed on all. Yet for all its roles and symbolism, the hearth wasn't free from danger. Wooden beams in close proximity to flames often scorched, and a stray ember could ignite anything from thatched roofing to strewn rushes on the floor. Despite precarity, families saw its presence as non-optional, a promise they worked daily to protect. But what made this element of medieval life truly profound was not simply its ability to heat and sustain, but its persistent presence even in times of scarcity or suffering. Children quietly listening to stories while light dwindled, adults sipping broth warmed directly above flames, or someone softly poking at glowing embers to reset their heat for supper. Every valley of life filtered toward this source. It wasn't just a tool of surviving. It brought meaning to that survival, stitching communal warmth into the very fabric of winter dark. And yet, long beyond when the fire's warmth faded, a more persistent challenge remained. Those long, lightless stretches untouched by the sun. To endure the dark was another layer altogether. How did medieval peasants keep the shadows from swallowing their spirits whole when the rhythm of flames dwindled? Let's find out what illuminated their long nights. In the unbroken darkness of medieval winters, light was more than a convenience. It was a lifeline. Picture nights so long and deep that the edges of the world seemed to blur. The sun gone for hours on end and shadows pooling in every corner. This wasn't merely a physical challenge, it was a psychological trial that weighed heavily on the minds of peasant families. Without electricity to push back the night, darkness settled in like a second skin, spreading a sense of isolation that could feel almost suffocating. The slightest flicker of light became a spark of control, a way to claim back a fragment of the relentless winter. But creating this light was no easy feat. For peasants, who lived their lives on the edge of subsistence, finding an affordable and lasting source of illumination posed a real challenge. The simplest and most widely available option was the lucina. These were thin slivers of dry wood, often cut from birch or pine, that were placed upright in a small metal stand. Once lit, a lucina burned briefly, producing a small, wavering glow accompanied by an acrid smoke. The smell of charred wood mixed with the sting of smoke-filled air made these basic light sources far from perfect. What's more, they required constant tending. A child, crouched close to the hearth, might take on the task of replacing one after another, feeding the light as if it were a tiny, fragile creature. These slivers didn't brighten the room so much as they kept some of the shadows at bay, their soft, uneven glow allowing families to see just enough to continue working through the long evenings. For those seeking something more reliable, fat lamps offered another option. These lamps were simple in design, small clay or metal pots filled with animal fat, equipped with a wick made of moss, hemp, or cloth. They burned more steadily than lucinas, casting a gentler and more consistent light, but they came with their own set of problems. The fat, an extremely valuable resource, was often needed for cooking or as food for the family, so burning it for light was a decision not made lightly. The lamps also gave off a heavy, unpleasant odor, the rich scent of burning fat clinging to the smoky air. Still, for a peasant family with limited choices, such lamps were a functional way to keep their homes lit, even if the quality of light was far from ideal.
Then there were tallow candles, an improvement over fat lamps in brightness and longevity, but a luxury for most. These candles were made by repeatedly dipping a wick into melted animal fat, gradually building up layer after layer until the candle was thick enough to burn for hours. The process was tedious and time-consuming, requiring patience as well as access to quantities of fat that many families simply didn't have. Because of the effort involved, tallow candles were primarily reserved for special occasions or religious observances, their steady glow lending solemnity and importance to moments otherwise defined by scarcity. For the wealthiest members of society, or for the churches that held a central place in many communities, beeswax candles offered an even greater refinement. These candles burned cleanly and brightly, emitting neither the smoke nor the strong odors associated with tallow. Yet their cost placed them firmly out of reach for the average peasant, making them a rare and aspirational item. In some regions, households explored a method slightly more efficient than individual light sources. Grease lamps, sometimes referred to as mokels, used the same principle as fat lamps, but were designed to maximize resource conservation. A floating wick rested in a small pot of liquid grease, allowing the flame to burn longer while using less fuel overall. This small innovation highlighted the characteristic creativity of medieval peasants, who constantly adapted to their environment in order to survive. These lamps may not have provided brilliant light, but they represented an ongoing effort to stretch every resource to its breaking point, and often just a little beyond. Light wasn't just about function, though. It carried an emotional and symbolic weight that helped people face the psychological toll of winter. In the endless dark, a single flame could feel like a barrier against far more than shadows. Firelight symbolized life and order, a boundary between the warmth of the hearth and the chaos believed to linger outside. In some traditions, the flame itself was thought to have protective powers, warding off spirits or ill fortune. Even the simplest act of lighting a small lamp or watching as a lucina flickered against a rough wooden wall became a moment of quiet significance. This battle against the encroaching dark wasn't just a practical act. It was a ritual that reaffirmed hope and resilience.
For a peasant family gathered around the central hearth, the dim light did more than illuminate, it comforted. The glow of a flame created a space where work and rest could coexist. Tasks that couldn't wait for daylight, like spinning wool or mending clothing, continued late into the evening. Children leaned in close, eyes sparkling with firelight as they listened to tales passed down through generations. Stories woven in the soft glow became more than entertainment. They reinforced bonds and helped strengthen the sense of community that was so necessary during the most difficult months of the year. In the sparse light, imagination bloomed, and the room that had earlier been filled with hard labor now held an air of quiet magic. The very act of maintaining light became woven into the rhythm of life. Just as the fire in the hearth was tended carefully each night, so too were the lamps and candles. Wicks were trimmed, the flames softened and guided into steady growth, and when needed, extinguished carefully, never with haste or carelessness. To many families, these rituals of light echoed a broader understanding of life's fragility, its need for constant care. Light was never wasted and always cherished, even in its smallest form. Yet, despite these efforts, the dim illumination offered by lucinas, fat lamps, and candles could only do so much. Medieval homes still plunged into shadowy quiet once the flames burned low, the darkest hours of night reducing entire families to stillness. In these moments, even the faintest glow became reassuring. It was a reminder that they had not surrendered to the night entirely. This faint light offered control, not over the outside world, but over a small pocket of it, enough to keep despair from settling in. For medieval peasants, the quest for light each winter was a constant reminder of their ingenuity and resourcefulness. Though the practicalities of lucinas, fat lamps, and tallow candles shaped their evenings, the symbolic and emotional power of light was just as important. A small flame could become a beacon, not just against physical darkness, but against the heavier shadow of hopelessness. A flickering fire wasn't merely practical, it was a means of survival in a much broader sense. Though their methods may seem humble, the importance of light in these dark stretches of the year cannot be overstated. It defined how peasants occupied their evenings, shaped their beliefs, and helped them endure the long months of winter. And yet, for all the comfort provided by firelight, survival required more than brightness. It required food, and plenty of it. But how did medieval peasants keep their supplies from spoiling in the freezing cold? Let's explore how they turned nature's chill into their own makeshift refrigerator. Surviving the long winter months depended not just on enduring the cold, but on ensuring there was enough food to last until spring. Without modern refrigeration, medieval peasants faced a monumental challenge: how to keep their supplies safe from spoilage, pests, and the biting frost. The solutions they found were rooted in practicality and an intimate understanding of their natural surroundings. These methods were less about luxury and more about necessity, each one playing a vital role in winter survival. To start, meat was one of the most challenging resources to preserve. Slaughtering animals in anticipation of winter meant facing the immediate problem of preventing the meat from wasting. Two methods became crucial: salting and smoking. Salting involved rubbing generous amounts of salt into cuts of meat or placing them in heavily salted brine. The salt worked to draw out moisture, creating an environment where bacteria struggled to grow. Meanwhile, smoking offered an additional layer of preservation. Meat was slowly dried above a smoldering fire, the smoke acting as both a desiccant and a preservative. Salting involved rubbing meat with salt or brining it in a saltwater solution, which drew out moisture and inhibited bacterial growth, while smoking exposed the meat to smoke from a smoldering fire, further drying it and adding preservatives from the smoke itself. These techniques, while functional, weren't without inconvenience. Salt was a valuable resource, sometimes difficult for poorer families to acquire, and smoking required a significant time investment. Still, with these methods, meat could last weeks or even months, providing a reliable protein source when fresh food was a distant memory. Grains, another cornerstone of the medieval diet, also required careful handling. Cereals like wheat, barley, and oats were harvested in the late summer or fall and had to remain edible through the dead of winter, lest bread, the daily staple, disappear from the table. Storing grains in dry, airtight containers became the primary solution. Clay pots, wooden barrels, or even sacks coated with fat to repel pests helped protect grain supplies from both rodents and moisture. The labor involved in safely storing and regularly checking these supplies required diligence, but it was an investment in survival. This involved storing grains in dry, airtight containers, protecting them from moisture and pests, and ensuring a consistent supply of bread, a staple food, throughout the winter. Losing even part of a harvest to mold or vermin might lead to devastating shortages, forcing families to stretch their rations far thinner than planned. Fresh vegetables, unlike grains, presented an additional layer of complexity. Their perishability made storing them more difficult, but peasants turned to root cellars for answers. These underground spaces, dug into the cool earth, provided natural refrigeration. Darkness, steady humidity, and insulating layers of soil created a space where root vegetables like carrots, turnips, and parsnips could last for months. These cellars weren't elaborate, but they worked. Root cellars were essential for storing root vegetables like carrots and turnips, providing cool, stable conditions to prevent spoilage. For families relying on sturdy crops to provide vitamins through restrictive winter diets, the role of the root cellar went beyond convenience. It became a lifeline. But root cellars were only one method among many. In regions where winters brought freezing temperatures, ice pits offered another innovative solution. By harvesting ice from rivers or lakes and storing it in deep, insulated pits, families could create a cold environment that mimicked refrigeration. The ice was packed tightly with layers of straw or sawdust acting as insulation, often keeping perishables fresh until spring. Ice cellars served as primitive refrigerators, utilizing the cold of winter to preserve perishable goods, providing a vital source of protein and sustenance throughout the winter. Meat, fish, and produce might be stored here, their quality preserved far longer than in a warmer space. These pits required preparation and careful management, yet their simplicity highlights the resourcefulness of people working in harmony with the seasons. In snow-heavy regions, even the snowfall itself became a resource. Food was wrapped carefully in hides or sheets of birch bark, and then buried in thick snowdrifts, which created an insulating cocoon. These makeshift snow cellars provided another way of keeping perishables from spoiling in the absence of proper storage. Snow cellars used the insulating properties of snow to store perishables. Food wrapped in hides or birch bark was buried in deep snowdrifts, which maintained a stable low temperature and protected supplies from rodents and predators. This method, though rudimentary,
reflected the creativity and adaptability required of peasant communities. Beyond simply preserving food in its natural state, medieval peasants understood the value of transforming it. Fermentation became a cornerstone of food preservation, offering the dual benefit of extending shelf life and enhancing nutritional value. Foods like sauerkraut, pickled apples, and fermented dairy not only lasted longer but also developed rich flavors and health benefits. Fermentation was a crucial method, offering the dual benefits of extending shelf life and enriching food with beneficial bacteria and vitamins. This process provided critical nutrients, such as vitamin C, which helped ward off scurvy during the bleakest parts of the year. The act of fermenting foods also carried cultural importance. Rituals and traditional practices sprang up around tasks like sauerkraut preparation, turning a chore into an act of communal engagement. Dairy products posed a different type of challenge. Without refrigeration, fresh milk spoiled quickly, but medieval peasants knew how to transform it into longer-lasting forms. Churned into butter or aged into cheese, milk took on new forms that could endure winter's demands. Butter, stored in cool cellars, provided essential fats, and cheeses gained durability as they aged, their flavors deepening while their practicality increased. These dairy products often became centerpieces of peasant meals, offering both sustenance and comfort during the darkest days of the year. Even fruits played a role in the preservation story. Dried apples, pears, and berries contributed sweetness and variety to winter diets. While the drying process was less common than other methods, it provided yet another way to extend the life of summer's bounty. All these efforts, though laborious, turned ephemeral harvests into stable, dependable supplies that could be relied on when new crops were still months away. Yet, for all their effort, food preservation wasn't foolproof. A sudden thaw, a poorly sealed container, or simply an oversight could lead to disaster. Spoilage and shortages were, unfortunately, common realities. When supplies ran low, survival demanded resourcefulness beyond stored foods. Foraging, rationing, and even sharing among families became part of the broader survival strategy. Still, the methods crafted for food storage showcased a profound understanding of both nature's resources and its challenges. Through every salted cut of meat, every carefully laid layer of straw in an ice pit, and every bite of fermented vegetables, medieval peasants found ways to make the cold their ally. They harnessed its preserving power, transforming the biting frost into a shield against hunger. The months of preparation that went into winter survival were exhausting but vital. These simple methods, born of necessity and honed by experience, were woven into the rhythms of life as naturally as the changing seasons themselves. As effective as these methods were, they couldn't completely eliminate scarcity. Supplies had limits, and when they ran out, peasants had to turn to the wilderness for sustenance, seeking food in the forests, fields, and streams. What did they find? And how did these last desperate measures shape their survival? Let's explore how medieval communities relied on nature's hidden offerings to make it through the leanest months. When food stores dwindled and spring's promise felt impossibly far, medieval peasants turned to the forest for survival. These were the hungry months, bleak stretches of February and March when winter's grip lingered, but hard-earned supplies of salted meat, stored grains, and root vegetables grew dangerously low. With nothing left to fall back on, the wilderness became a fragile lifeline, forcing families to risk the cold and their own safety to find sustenance in unexpected places. What they gathered, prepared, and consumed during this time was often bitter, heavy, and barely nourishing, but it held starvation at a distance just long enough to survive until the thaw. One of the surprising survival foods that people relied on during dire winters was tree bark. Not the rugged outer layer you see flaking away from a trunk, but the soft, pale inner layer of the bark known as cambium. Peasants would carefully strip away this layer from trees like pine or birch, taking special care not to kill the tree itself. Cambium, though not naturally appetizing, was processed into something just edible. It would be boiled repeatedly to soften both its texture and its sharp bitterness. Once dried, the fibers could be ground into a coarse flour that was mixed with other flours to stretch bread supplies, or formed into dense cakes to be baked on the hearth. These cakes were heavy in the stomach and provided little nutrition, but they created a sense of fullness, a brief illusion of sustenance. Acorns were another fallback option, though they were far from simple to prepare. Gathered during the autumn months and stored through the winter, acorns were abundant in many areas, but their bitter tannins made them inedible in their natural state. Removing the bitterness required careful preparation. Acorns were soaked in multiple changes of water, sometimes even buried in river mud, where the running water slowly leached out the tannins. Afterward, they would be dried, pounded into a dark, grainy flour, and added to thick soups or porridge. The final result was neither pleasant nor particularly nutritious, but like bark flour, it brought a necessary sense of fullness. The labor-intensive preparation also highlights the ingenuity and determination needed to survive during the harshest months.
Beneath the snow, peasants searched for edible roots, often guided by the dry, withered stems that poked through the drifts. Roots from plants like wheatgrass, bok, or reeds became a last resort when other options ran out. These roots, while modest in size and flavor, represented a critical source of energy when the body was drained. Peasants had an intimate knowledge of their local landscapes and an almost instinctive awareness of where such plants could still be found in the depths of winter. Digging them out was grueling work, often done with frozen hands and under the threat of exhaustion, but even the smallest yield was worth the effort. Once cleaned of dirt and boiled, the roots became palatable, barely. They were more a reminder of the forest's reluctant generosity than a true source of nourishment. For those desperate enough to risk a venture deeper into the wilderness, hunting small game became a pathway to survival, albeit one fraught with danger. Hares, squirrels, and forest birds like wood pigeons offered fleeting opportunities for valuable sustenance. Peasants set snares made of horsehair or fashioned traps from willow twigs in hopes of capturing something, anything, that could be eaten. Meat was incredibly scarce during this time of year, as most animals were either too lean or hibernating. When traps did succeed, a single hare or small bird was cause for quiet celebration. These animals were more than food. They were resources. Their bones became soup stock, their skins could be dried and used as patches for clothing, and even feathers were carefully collected. Nothing was wasted. A successful hunt in the dead of winter felt like a rare triumph, a reminder that persistence could still, occasionally, pay off. Yet not every meal was a victory. During the harshest winters, some peasants were forced to consume carrion, the decomposed remains of animals that had died from cold, starvation, or even illness. This desperate measure carried profound risks. Meat from these fallen animals was highly dangerous, harboring the potential for disease and poisoning. Despite the inherent dangers, people sometimes had no choice. The slow agony of hunger drove them to prepare and eat what their better judgment would have rejected. Consuming carrion also carried a heavy social and psychological weight. To eat the flesh of a dead animal, especially one found in the forest after days or weeks, was seen as both a physical and spiritual low point. Stories of illness, suffering, and even death from such meals were common, but they served as grim reminders of the realities peasants faced when bound by winter's cold grip. Amid this scarcity, the forest was not only a source of struggle, but also of occasional moments of hope. The first signs of spring brought immense relief to those who had survived the winter's ordeal. Early wild plants like nettles and sorrel would push up through the final patches of melting snow. These fresh greens, delicate and vibrant, seemed almost like gifts. After months of eating dried, salted, or otherwise processed food, the first bite of something new and living was a revelation. Nettles, though prickly to the touch at first, became soft and tender when boiled into soups. Sorrel, with its sharp, citrus-like tang, added a brightness to meals that hadn't been tasted for months. These greens were more than just nutrients. They were symbols of renewal and survival, proof that winter had a limit, and that life could emerge from even the harshest conditions. This relationship with the forest shaped the way medieval peasants thought about the natural world. It wasn't simply a backdrop to their lives, it was a partner in their survival. Every morsel gathered during the desperate months of winter came with a profound sense of gratitude. Even foods that were bitter, tough, or barely edible were accepted as gifts, not guarantees.
This gratitude was especially deep when the shift toward spring began, as communities could finally loosen their tight grip on survival and look toward planting, growth, and renewal. The practice of foraging wasn't just about necessity, it also reflected an incredible depth of knowledge about the land. Recognizing the right tree from which to strip bark, understanding how to safely prepare acorns, knowing where edible roots were likely to survive. All of these skills were passed down through generations, typically taught in childhood. They were acts of survival, but also acts of inheritance. Each method, no matter how small, reflected the lived experience of those who had come before. These collective lessons were preserved through families and communities, ensuring that even in the harshest years, no one had to face starvation without the wisdom of the past to guide them. Winter, for all its wild and unforgiving nature, revealed the resilience and adaptability of those who endured it. The forest could be hostile, a place of biting cold and unknown dangers, but it also offered quiet opportunities. Beneath its trees and frozen ground lay small but sufficient answers to questions of survival. Whether it was a bitter acorn, a tangled root, or the faint promise of hunting game, peasants discovered, again and again, that the world held what they needed, if they had the courage to find it.
Even as they leaned on the forest to sustain their bodies, surviving winter wasn't only a physical battle. The biting cold didn't just numb the skin, it crept into the spaces between their fragile layers of clothing, testing their ability to shield themselves. What strategies helped peasants armor themselves against the cold, and how did their clothing serve as their first line of defense? Let's unfold that story next. In a world where fires sputtered and walls barely held off the biting cold, clothing became a medieval peasant's most reliable defense against winter. Unlike today, when warmth can be taken for granted with insulated materials and climate-controlled homes, medieval survival meant layering strategically, balancing what little resources were available. Every piece of fabric was a deliberate choice, every added layer a shield against the elements. Clothing wasn't simply comfort, it was armor. The foundation of this armor often started with linen. Linen undergarments, though light, acted as an essential barrier between the skin and the rougher, heavier materials worn above them. They protected the body from irritation, as coarser fabrics like wool could be scratchy and uncomfortable. Linen was also practical as it absorbed sweat and moisture, keeping the skin dry, a luxury critical in such harsh conditions. A dry body was easier to keep warm. Though linen itself wasn't warm, its ability to support the layers above it made it indispensable. Early in life, individuals learned to value those first layers as the key to building warmth, one fold of cloth at a time. Above the linen came wool, the mainstay of medieval winter wear. Wool was prized for its natural insulating properties, trapping body heat and providing warmth even when damp. This unique feature of wool could be the difference between enduring the cold and succumbing to it, especially after exposure to snow or sleet. Clothing crafted from wool came in various styles. Simple tunics, heavy skirts, or long cloaks ensured that the core of the body retained as much heat as possible. Wool garments were often layered, perhaps a thinner layer close to the body beneath heavier overcoats. The thickness of wool varied depending on availability, but even the poorest families sought ways to incorporate it into their clothing. It was a material that stood between survival and suffering.
Then there was outerwear, often lined with fur when possible. Fur provided an additional layer of protection, especially against sharp, icy winds. Though fur wasn't readily available to everyone, its scarcity meant it was usually reserved for wealthier individuals or rare acquisitions. It offered a significant advantage where it was used. A cloak lined with fur, even minimally, drastically increased the wearer's ability to withstand freezing gales. For peasants, imitating this with thicker woolen cloaks or layered wraps became a necessity. Even without fur, cloaks themselves were essential. Not only did they provide extra warmth for the body, but they doubled as portable blankets when traveling short distances or braving the outdoors to gather wood or tend to livestock. Clothing accessories were equally vital in sealing the body's warmth. Mittens were a common sight in winter, a design with simple practicality. Unlike gloves, which separated the fingers and allowed cold air to circulate more easily, mittens trapped warmth by grouping fingers together. For additional dexterity, two-fingered mittens became popular, offering a compromise between function and warmth. Scarves or wraps, often made from wool or scraps of fabric, helped shield the neck and lower face from frost. Layered tightly over cloaks or tunics, these pieces turned vulnerable areas of the body into well-defended zones, ensuring that even in biting winds, exposed skin remained shielded. Footwear, too, played a critical role. Leather-soled boots, when well made, created a barrier between feet and the snow, preventing heat from being leached away through constant contact with frozen ground. Simple designs were enough to keep frostbite at bay, though they were often reinforced with woolen stockings or stuffed with straw for added insulation. For those with limited means, wooden clog-like shoes might be used, though they were less effective at sealing out the cold. Still, these efforts underscored a widespread truth. Even the smallest adjustments to clothing could mean the difference between enduring hardship and succumbing to it. The fight against the cold didn't stop with waking hours. Nights, spent in homes barely warmer than the outdoors, required extra layers for sleep. Nightcaps were essential for retaining heat through the head, which naturally lost more warmth than other parts of the body. Made from scraps of leftover fabric, often linen or wool, these caps became staples of bedtime preparation. Combined with thick blankets and additional layers of clothing worn to sleep, they made even the coldest nights survivable. As an added measure, heated stones were sometimes used to warm beds. Pulled fresh from the hearth, these smooth stones would be wrapped in cloth and tucked into blankets before sleep. They radiated small but meaningful warmth, providing temporary relief from the cold and making the initial moments of rest slightly more bearable.
Of course, not everyone had equal access to warm clothing. Wealthier families enjoyed luxuries like finer wool, larger quantities of fur, and professionally crafted garments. Their cloaks might sweep the floor with dramatic fullness, or their boots might have additional layers of lining to keep their feet cozy even in the harshest conditions. For peasants, however, every garment was practical, stitched together with resources at hand and lasting as long as the weave could endure. Pieces often served multiple purposes, repurposed when worn thin. A tunic might become a patchwork quilt, or an old cloak could be layered over rushes at night for added bedding. This creativity wasn't rare, it was essential for survival. Despite their limited means, peasants approached winter clothing with resourcefulness. Rationing scarce materials and patching existing garments extended their usefulness, while cooperation within communities sometimes eased the burden of preparing for winter. A neighbor might swap wool scraps for a bundle of rushes, or trade mended shoes for a favor down the line. Clothing, simple as it was, tied people together. A child wearing layers sewn by their mother, or a cloak passed down through generations, carried a kind of warmth that went beyond physical heat. The act of dressing for winter became almost ritualistic, a quiet moment each day as peasants layered themselves with care. Each piece of fabric was added with intention, every knot tied firmly against creeping drafts. And while these layers were necessary for protection from the elements, they also provided something more, a sense of security. There was comfort in the enveloping weight of a woolen tunic or the snug pull of a scarf around the neck. These practical clothes became a source of reassurance, offering not just warmth but stability in the face of long winters that seemed unending. The battle against the cold was constant, fought with every stitch of linen or loop of wool, from dawn until sleep. It was a war of small victories, each successfully mended garment or well-layered outfit standing as an act of defiance against a season that offered no mercy. Peasants didn't have the luxury of grandeur in their clothing, but through practicality and determination, they turned necessity into resilience.
But there was an enemy even greater than cold. Winter often came with an unshakable loneliness, isolating families as snow piled high and darkness stretched on. Yet even in this desolation, connection proved to be an even greater source of warmth. How did these communities come together to survive? Let's explore the bonds that helped medieval peasants endure. When the cold became relentless and the nights seemed never-ending, survival in medieval winters was not a solitary endeavor. It wasn't enough to light fires, layer clothing, or preserve food. For many, it was the strength of their community bonds that kept them alive. People depended on one another,
finding warmth not just in fire, but in human connection. These ties weren't just practical. They wove a safety net, held tightly together by the shared challenges of the season. The cold isolated families physically, but socially, it brought them together. Winter imposed harsh realities that no one could face alone. Life slowed as snow blocked roads, frozen rivers halted travel, and darkness blanketed villages for longer than daylight ever could. This isolation reinforced interdependence. Every neighbor was aware of the struggles next door, and the risks of those struggles going unmet. Loneliness weighed heavily on the mind during these months, increasing the need for communication between households, even if it was just brief contact. People leaned on neighbors for quick words or shared resources, aware that this small connection might relieve not just the physical challenges, but also the emotional strain of winter. Illness, too, was a constant specter, creeping into homes where cold and hunger weakened bodies. A single sickness, untreated or unnoticed, could sweep through families without warning. The physical risks of scarcity and separation placed an even greater emphasis on looking out for one another, binding communities closer. When life grew unbearably cold, shared meals became a lifeline. Families who might spend much of the year tending to their own affairs began to pool their resources, often bringing what little they had to feast together. Communal meals served more than one purpose. They stretched resources further, allowing food to be prepared in larger batches and eaten more efficiently. It was also a necessary disruption to the monotony of survival, a reason to gather, even for a short time, and rekindle some feeling of normalcy. The food itself was simple, often soups or stews made from preserved vegetables, and whatever grains or meat were available. But what it represented was far greater. Sitting next to others, sharing ladles of warmth, provided not only calories but also reassurance. The act of dining together reminded people that they were not enduring the winter alone.
For those who could arrange it, festivals punctuated the long winters as well. They ranged from modest family gatherings to village-wide celebrations, depending on the resources and traditions of the region. Winter festivals didn't demand extravagant feasts or elaborate gifts. Their purpose lay in breaking through the bleakness, offering families and neighbors a collective moment of joy. These events often aligned with the church calendar, such as Christmas or Candlemas, though elements of older seasonal traditions remained deeply embedded in many of them. Villagers might come together to sing, tell stories, or play music. Children, who were often confined indoors during the shortest days of the year, could laugh and play while elders mingled and shared wisdom. Even a simple gathering emphasized human warmth, proving it could persist despite the harshness outside. At the heart of many communities was the local church, which served a dual role during the winter months. Spiritually, it offered guidance and comfort to those weathering the psychological strain of cold, hunger, and uncertainty. The church's ceremonies brought people together, giving hope through shared faith and prayers for better days. But the church wasn't only a place of worship. It also played a practical part in survival. It served as a hub for communal aid, organizing the collection and distribution of resources. In some villages, the church managed grain stores or communal granaries to ensure that enough food was available for everyone. These granaries were tightly regulated, and supplies were doled out carefully to families who needed them the most. Firewood, another lifeline in the cold, was also often distributed through the church, with able-bodied villagers assigned the task of gathering and sharing enough to keep the flames alive in every home. Neighborly aid took many forms throughout the season. Something as simple as helping a family fetch water from a frozen stream was no small task, especially when ice built up and trips became hazardous. Carrying a bucket back to a neighbor's home might have seemed like a small gesture, but it reflected the deep understanding that survival depended on mutual effort. Firewood, too, was often shared. If a family's supply ran too low to sustain them, neighbors might offer a bundle from their own stock, a small sacrifice for the security of the greater group. When illness struck, people banded together to care for the sick, delivering meals or tending livestock to ease the burden on the affected household. These acts were not seen as exceptional but expected, an unspoken rule that everyone at some point would owe or provide such care. In some regions, these bonds extended even further as families came together under a single roof.
Communal winter houses emerged in areas facing extreme winters, where sharing heat, food, and effort became a necessity. These houses, built to hold multiple families, were a hybrid of practicality and collective survival. The design combined functionality with communal living, with earthen floors, shared hearths, and sleeping areas crowded with bodies huddled for warmth. Privacy disappeared altogether in these spaces, but what they lacked in personal comfort, they made up for in security. Large pots of communal stew often simmered over flames, and food was rationed according to need. Leadership within these homes frequently fell to an elder who distributed responsibilities, organized supplies, and maintained order. This blending of families erased boundaries. Individual groups merged into one extended collective where survival was everyone's shared concern. In these communal spaces, human connections took on a new depth. People spent long evenings gathered around the fire, not only warming their bodies but strengthening their spirits. The presence of others brought reassurance, turning what might have been lonely, silent stretches of night into hours filled with talk and storytelling. Old tales from bygone generations were shared, cementing bonds between young and old. Laughter wasn't unheard of, even in such conditions. It became a temporary release from the weight of survival. There was no room for isolation in communal houses. Every person mattered. Every effort was acknowledged. In the midst of winter's relentlessness, these houses stood as symbols of shared endurance. The necessity of sharing food, space, and responsibility left lasting ripples in communities. Relationships formed during harsh winters often carried on into the warmer months, strengthening interdependence across seasons. Neighbors might remember an outstretched hand or a shared meal long after the snow had melted, solidifying bonds that would persist into the next hardship. Because winter was never truly over in a medieval world, it always returned, regular as time itself, bringing with it challenges but also reaffirming connections. As hard as winter made life, it also showcased the resilience of human connection. Through shared meals, communal aid, and the constant hum of cooperation, people forged a type of solidarity that no layer of snow or stretch of darkness could break. When bodies grew vulnerable and fires burned low, these bonds filled the gaps, creating warmth far more sustaining than heat alone ever could.
Yet even with food to share and bonds to depend on, days were long and tasks monotonous. Through the endless nights, peasants found ways to keep not just their spirits alive, but their hands busy with craft and creation. Together they turned the quiet hours into moments of purpose. What did they create in these deeply practical yet strangely joyful moments? Let's uncover how medieval communities wove hope and resilience into the fabric of their daily lives. During the long, dark winter evenings, medieval peasants discovered ways to occupy their hands and their minds, transforming the stillness of the season into something useful, even hopeful. Surrounded by scarcity and cold, they chose to create, repair, and share, rather than surrender to the harsh monotony. These evenings, though challenging, became a time for work that wasn't simply about survival. It was work that helped maintain a sense of purpose, one thread or stroke of a tool at a time. Women often turned to spinning and weaving, tasks that filled countless winter hours with the steady whir of spinning wheels and the rhythmic clatter of looms. Sitting close to the hearth's glow, they twisted bundles of raw wool into sturdy thread, which would later be woven into fabric. This process, while repetitive, was deeply necessary. The rhythmic motion of the spindle and loom became a familiar soundtrack of winter evenings, providing a sense of order and continuity in a world often defined by chaos. The cloth they produced wasn't decorative, it was uncompromisingly practical. Durable homespun wool would be used to sew new tunics, mend cloaks, or patch holes in worn-out garments. These fabrics might even be traded within the village, turning domestic labor into a small but vital part of the local economy. For women, weaving wasn't just a chore, it was a reaffirmation of their role as providers, caregivers, and sustainers of the family through the trials of winter. The importance of craftsmanship wasn't limited to women's hands. Men took up their tools during these dark months, completing repairs and carving new items by the flickering light of torches or grease lamps. Agricultural tools like plows and harrows, battered from the year's labor, would be inspected and restored in preparation for spring planting. This work demanded focus and care, as these tools were the backbone of the family's ability to cultivate the earth and secure their next harvest. The stakes of their work extended far beyond the workshop. Broken plows or dull blades meant wasted time and energy during the most critical parts of the growing season. Alongside these repairs,
Men carved wood harvested from previous seasons into new utensils, toys, or simple household tools. A few careful strokes of a knife might form a spoon. Another set might create a small game for a child tucked into the dark corners of a cottage. They also carved new utensils, toys, and other household items from wood harvested in the summer, providing essential tools and a touch of joy in the face of hardship. These small acts of carving and building balance practicality with the quiet satisfaction of creation. The work, be it spinning, mending, or carving, held more than just practical value. There was something soothing about the repetitive motion, the steady engagement of the hands. These tasks carried their own meditative quality, allowing people to focus not on the cold that seeped through their walls or the scarcity of food, but on something tangible, something they could finish. The monotonous, meditative labor was a way to keep one's sanity confined, preventing discouragement and fear from consuming the soul. The act of crafting wasn't just a way to pass time. It was an anchor that kept the mind busy while the body stayed still. Hours might slip by unnoticed, broken only by the small satisfaction of completed work to show at the day's end. Yet not all winter activity was solitary. The darkness brought people together, often around the hearth, where hours of work were softened by the companionship of others. Villagers shared advice on weaving techniques, tools were borrowed back and forth, and bits of extra wool were exchanged for a handful of dried herbs. This practical cooperation fostered connections that were as essential to survival as the goods themselves. Working together ensured collective resilience, a quiet but powerful acknowledgement of interdependence. Winter crafts also fostered social interaction, as people often worked together, sharing advice and tools, creating bonds that were essential for survival. While survival may have been the primary goal, these moments of connection narrowed the distance that winter so often threatened to impose. Of course, not every winter hour was spent bent over a loom or carving knife. Evenings offered precious time for community, for moments of warmth that broke through winter's suffocating cycle of chores. Music, played on simple flutes, drums, or stringed instruments, helped pass the hours while lifting the spirits of those in the room. The soft hum of a mother's song, or the staccato rhythm of an old folk tune reshaped the atmosphere, reminding all who heard it that hardship didn't have to drown out joy. Dancing, though limited by space, added liveliness to the evenings, with each step on packed earth floors energizing the cold-slowed body. And then there were stories, perhaps the most cherished tradition of these long nights. Around the fire, elders shared memories and legends. Young children huddled close as their imaginations painted vivid pictures of deeds and places far beyond their small village. Some stories passed down practical wisdom, lessons on when to plant, how to recognize edible plants, or what signs to watch for as winter transitioned to spring. Others ventured into familiar folklore, tales of heroes, spirits, and tricksters that added spark and wonder to the dim firelight. Storytelling in particular served as a way to pass down survival wisdom, with tales of heroes, myths, and practical advice woven into the fabric of daily life, providing both entertainment and a sense of cultural continuity. These stories did more than entertain. They preserved culture, memory, and solidarity. Though these small moments of art and creation seem humble, they carried immense weight for those living on the edge of survival. Crafting something, whether fabric, a tool, or even a story to share, represented something deeply human, an ability to take the world around them, however harsh or limited, and shape it into something purposeful. Creation offered a sense of control, a rare comfort in a season where nature's dominance was inescapable. The creation of new items and the repair of old ones gave peasants a sense of control over their lives and hope for the coming spring, offering a tangible connection to the future. The labor of their hands tied them to better days ahead, to the first thaw, to the first green buds. The very act of making was a form of quiet rebellion against the season itself. Against the cold, they spun warmth. Against the hunger, they prepared tools to grow food. Against the isolation, they built community through shared skills. In each of these acts, there was a resistance, a refusal to let winter overpower hope. The ability to create and repair was a form of resistance against winter's bleakness, offering a sense of agency in the face of adversity. In the dim light of the hearth, as wool tightened into thread or carved wood took the shape of a simple figure, peasants found ways to endure. They worked not just to stay warm or full, but to remind themselves and one another that they could shape the world around them, even if only in small, humble ways. Against the backdrop of dark skies and snow-covered fields, these moments of craft and connection became threads that helped hold their communities together. But there was more to winter survival than productivity and social warmth. Beneath those acts of resilience, deeper rituals helped peasants safeguard not just their hearths, but their inner worlds. What protected their sense of hope when the darkness outside seemed to seep into their very thoughts? Let's explore how simple yet profound rituals gave them tools to endure the mental toll of winter.
The cold and darkness of a medieval winter didn't stay outside. They crept into the mind, settling in the spaces between daily chores and surviving the season's physical challenges. With the world around them frozen and silent, medieval peasants faced not only hunger and cold, but also isolation and the suffocating weight of long nights. Days blurred together, and time seemed to stretch endlessly under heavy skies, testing not just their bodies, but their spirits. Without outlets for distraction or modern comforts to pass time, the nights could breed fear or despondency. The darkness granted the imagination fertile ground to dwell on uncertainties, on sickness, on scarcity, on whether the spring might come too late one year. To endure the psychological toll, peasants turned to rituals and practices that gave structure to the shapeless days and hope to the longest nights. The hearth became the focal point for these rituals, more than just a practical necessity. It was the spiritual and emotional center of the home, a place to draw light and meaning in equal measure. To medieval peasants, fire itself held sacred significance, a divine gift that symbolized life and protection. The fire was believed to connect the earthly world to higher realms, a little fragment of the heavenly fire brought into homes to guard against the unknown. Its care was a duty, undertaken not just with practicality but with reverence. Extinguishing the hearth's fire, even accidentally, was a grave omen, leaving a family vulnerable not only to the physical cold, but to spirits lurking in the dark. To spit into the fire or throw anything wasteful onto it was forbidden. Such actions disrespected its sacred role as a guardian force within the home. This reverence showed in the ways peasants interacted with the fire. Small offerings were often made at the hearth. A few crumbs of bread, a sprinkling of salt, or even drops of milk were placed near the glowing embers as a gift to the protector spirits they believed resided there. These spirits, sometimes imagined as the souls of ancestors, were thought to shelter the home and its inhabitants throughout the winter's trials. Gratitude to these unseen guardians wasn't simply a gesture of faith. It was a way to create a spiritual buffer against the long season's uncertainties. The offerings reinforced the belief that the family was not alone in their struggle and that unseen forces worked in their favor. The psychological burdens of winter were eased further by physical symbols of protection. Peasants carved or painted protective shapes onto door frames, shutters, or above hearths using simple, meaningful designs. Circles, spirals, and sun-like symbols were common and thought to ward off spirits or ill fortune. Some believed these shapes disrupted dark forces or redirected their paths away from the home. Hanging bundles of herbs near entrances provided another layer of defense, based on the belief that their strong scents drove away evil or disease. Juniper, wormwood, and thistle, for example, were associated with protection. These herbs were burned or left to dry, their smoke rising in small rituals meant to purify the home and bolster its defenses against whatever unspoken forces the night held. Winter was also a time when ancient folklore and stories took on renewed importance. After the evening tasks were finished, families gathered around the glow of the fire, letting words take the burden of the silence. These moments weren't just idle entertainment. Stories served to warn, teach, and provide continuity in an uncertain world. Tales of heroes defeating winter's challenges symbolized resilience and gave listeners models of hope and courage. Darker stories, of spirits, tricksters, and unseen dangers,
acted as reminders of caution and vigilance, teaching children early to respect the forest, the unknown, and even the cold itself. These narratives gave shape to the season's dangers, turning the vague fears that could settle in the mind into something familiar and therefore manageable. Through storytelling, wisdom passed from one generation to the next, encoded in tales that both entertained and prepared. Winter holidays, too, provided much-needed relief from the psychological strain. These celebrations, whether Christian in focus or echoes of older pagan traditions, were markers of joy and renewal in the bleakest weeks. The 12 days following Christmas, known as Holy Week in Christian traditions, or tied to Yule in older customs, became central to lifting spirits. During this time, restrictions on labor might temporarily ease, allowing for gatherings, games, and shared meals. Villagers visited one another, exchanging small gifts, or simply participating in communal activities that interrupted the sense of isolation. Mummers, dressed in costumes and masks, would parade through houses, symbolizing chaos visiting the ordered homes of the village before a final return to harmony. Every song sung or joke shared cut through the heaviness of winter, reminding everyone that they were part of a larger whole. Symbolic rituals often took place with the same purpose of instilling hope and signaling the eventual arrival of spring. Effigies of winter, painstakingly made from straw, were burned in bonfires as gestures of banishment. The ashes from such fires were sometimes scattered across fields, believed to renew their fertility for the coming planting season. In other regions, peasants baked small cookies shaped like larks, symbols of renewal and warmth, meant to call the birds back to fields soon to be green once more. Through these rituals, they performed an act of defiance against not just the physical winter, but what it represented: stagnation, stillness, even death. These moments gave time a rhythm and marked progress, helping to gently pull minds away from the fear that winter might never end. Herbs and charms also helped peasants address the psychological impacts of winter. While juniper or thistle protected spaces from spirits, other plants were considered comforting or calming, believed to protect the spirit as much as the body. Chamomile, for example, might be brewed into teas, easing troubled minds or allowing for better sleep. Lavender, though less common, was valued for its calming scent. Even the act of preparing these small remedies gave structure to the otherwise shapeless days, allowing peasants to feel grounded and in control. Mixed with spiritual rituals, these practices formed a natural blend of faith and practicality, creating tools for weathering not just the season but the doubts it brought. For all these collective rituals and symbols, the hearth remained the defining focus of winter. It provided not only warmth and nourishment but also emotional grounding, a place where the family gathered, offered thanks, told stories, and reinforced their connection to both one another and the unseen forces they felt watched over them. The fire burned steadily, a companion through the endless dark, its light holding back the vast unknown just beyond the walls. In these small, repeated gestures, whether offering bread to a spirit, carving a protective symbol, or laughing during a holiday feast, medieval peasants turned the psychological battle of winter into something manageable. They found meaning in the shadowed days and used ritual to keep hope alive, warding off the despair that could settle as heavily as frost on a window. These acts reminded them that seasons change, and as difficult as winter could be, the dawn would always return. The fire, the stories, the festivals, and the faint smell of herbs lingering in the air, all of it brought a sense of continuity and reassurance. Even in the darkest months, peasants built not just a physical refuge, but an emotional sanctuary within their homes. And while survival in the Middle Ages often depended on ingenuity and hard work, it also rested on less tangible things: hope, shared wisdom, and the quiet power of community. As we stand in our modern world, it's worth reflecting on how these resilient communities approached hardship with such a profound balance of practicality and meaning. Conclusion. Imagine the strength it took to survive those winters, relying on the land, the fire, and each other. Medieval peasants embraced life with simple tools, resourceful minds, and the warmth of shared moments. Their resilience wasn't just in what they built or preserved. It was found in their ability to face adversity together, turning the hardest days into a testament of human courage. Let their example remind us that simplicity and connection hold powerful lessons. Perhaps we too can pause to appreciate what sustains us, the warmth of home, the kindness of others, and carry their quiet wisdom into our modern lives.